Bessa, thanks very much. Can I just begin actually by acknowledging the High Commissioner to Singapore from New Zealand, Jonathan Austin, who was with me for a long time on the intelligence front when I was Prime Minister. It's great to see so many other friends that are here today. Can I acknowledge Midori, who's responsible for the international work that Dr. Handa does around the world. And we've been together in a great many places recently, not the least of them being Cambodia, where Dr. Handa has been active for a very long period of time, funding everything from universities to hospitals to orphanages. So making a sort of huge difference there. It's great to be back in Singapore. I kind of have a great affection for Singapore because amongst everything else I was born on the 9th of August, so I was born on National Singaporean Day, and I came here a couple of years ago in 2015 for the 50th celebration and pointed out to Prime Minister Lee at the time how nice it was that they'd put on this aerial display for my birthday, and we're having lunch actually after this, so I'm hopeful that he's going to have something equally to follow up for this visit to Singapore. On top of all that, my son was born at Mount Elizabeth Hospital, so he was born in Singapore, and so our family has a pretty close connection to everything that's happening out here, and of course I lived here for about a year. I suppose as a starting point, you know, when I became Prime Minister, which was back in 2008 in November, I kind of took the view that if you looked out in the horizon, it was a fairly bleak picture because of the global financial crisis, and at the time New Zealand itself was in its own self-enforced recession, which had really been driven because house prices had been very high, there'd been a big build-up in domestic debt, and the Reserve Bank was trying to slow the economy down. So you had a weak economy going into a GFC. So the outlook was pretty poor, but the one thing that I thought that could help offset the global financial crisis, other than the stimulation programs and the likes we saw, was really China. And at that point, our two-way trade between New Zealand and China was around about $8 billion. And the trade imbalance was in the favour of China, so China was pretty big exporter to New Zealand. And we had, just as a country, signed the FTA with China. That was one of the sort of four firsts that New Zealand often boasts about with China, not the least of them being recognising China as a market-based economy. So within Asia, we saw this, big potential opportunity with China. We could see what was happening in terms of all the things we know about there, but the sheer scale of China, the urbanisation that was taking place, the huge increase in demand for protein, and also the demand for services that New Zealand could produce, like export education, for instance. So we saw this really big opportunity in China, and we thought, well, that would be the great chance for us to sort of, during this period of weakness around the rest of the world, try and balance up our economy. And that strategy worked really well, so much so that two-way trade's about $23 billion now. And a few years back, on one of the 7 visits I made to China as Prime Minister, we set a target of having two-way trade of $30 billion by 2020, and we're fairly confident we're going to get there. So many people in the room will sort of know what's driving that, but largely it's been a huge demand for the likes of infant baby formula, but particularly food-based products. And you've seen an explosion in lots of areas, from wine to honey to all sorts of other services. So very big demand coming out of that Chinese market. So one of the reasons why I'm really optimistic about Asia is because I just think China's sheer scale is going to drag everybody through. And you hear all the stories of why we should be concerned, and you do have to put some of those concerns in the threat basket, and they really sit primarily around the health of the banking system in China, and whether there are a lot of bad debts that we don't know about, and whether that causes in itself a slowdown that we can't see. The only thing I would say about all of that is that if you look at the top 4 banks in China, they are very well capitalised and actually quite conservatively run. Where the risks are in the regional banks, and they are real and there, and the leadership will decide, I think, on a case-by-case basis which of them is allowed to fail and which of them is allowed to succeed. But broadly speaking, I would still say, notwithstanding the rundown on the reserves that you've seen in China, their capacity to manage that process still, to me, looks quite manageable. It's not perfect, but it's broadly pretty good. Secondly, even though their growth rate is slowing, and it was a bit stronger in the first quarter of this year than we all anticipated, it's still coming off a very big number. So you can go and do the mapping, but at some point there's a crossover point where China in nominal terms becomes a larger economy than the United States. Now again, they've got their own issues of an ageing population, ironically, for the rest of Asia, and partly saw them the leadership trying to reverse that with the move away from one-child policy. But in broad terms, I still think China's a big growth engine, and we sort of need to be part of that. The interesting thing, I think, in China too is that the leadership is very cognizant of the fact that I think they see themselves as just another dynasty. I think they've seen dynasties come and go in China, the Ming dynasty, the Qing dynasty. So, and the reason why I think that is that if you go back to the administration prior to Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang and have a look at Hu Jintao and the leadership that was in place there with Wen Xiaobo, they were amazingly responsive, I always thought, as a leadership team, and so is the current one. So I remember at one time, back a number of years ago when I was PM, you had the sinking of that submarine, and Vladimir Putin was on holiday, basically didn't even really bother returning from holiday despite the sort of national tragedy. And yet at a very, very similar time there were earthquakes in China, and the first thing the Chinese did was roll Wen Jiabao out to be there on the ground, looking at the situation, making sure the support was going in. This is an administration that really got a shake-up post-Tiananmen Square. I think they realised that they've got a very strong grip on power and control, but as they know, that can be quite tentative, and as we saw with the Arab Spring, these things can turn around quite quickly. So they're much more focused, I think, on the politics of what's happening than we might think. Certainly in recent times, you've seen Xi Jinping becoming a much stronger leader than you've seen in probably previous leadership groupings. But nevertheless, if you put it all to one side and you say, is China likely to be net additive or net negative to Asia? The answer is substantially still net additive. And the other big factor there is the change in what's thinking in China. So they're moving very much away from being that export-led economy to very much a domestic consumption, high-tech economy. So I remember years ago having lunch with Xi Jinping one time when we had APEC in Beijing, and him saying to me, look, gone are going to be the days of us assembling Apple's iPhones. We're going to build an iPhone that's going to beat Apple's, that's going to be better. And interesting enough, I think they look here in Singapore and see exactly that. I mean, you go back and trace, the people in this room know it far better than I do, but in the 1970s, Nike used to make its sand shoes here in Singapore. Today, they might sell a few sand shoes in Singapore, but that's about it. You're producing the most high-tech pharmaceuticals in the world, the most cutting-edge products. There's been that massive transition. Now, China's got a lot it's got to do in that space. It's still got 800 million people it's got to urbanise, but fundamentally the trajectory is in one place. And I think that's partly why you're seeing them do a number of things, not the least of them is starting to respond to environmental issues. So I don't think it would be lost on anyone that the day Donald Trump's pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, you've got Li Keqiang in Brussels basically saying that they are reaffirming their commitment to that. And partly that was sort of on display when we went to Beijing for APEC, when they closed down all of the factories and all of the polluting sort of areas for 6 weeks prior to the summit. And then Xi Jinping got up and said, this is what we call APEC blue. The sky was blue. And guess what? The 20-odd million people who lived in Beijing said, well, we want APEC blue every day. And so I think gone are those factories, if you know what I mean. So basically you've got a very changing position in China, and it's a place of many parts, and it won't always be one's, every step forward, but it's strong, and I wouldn't underestimate this, One Belt, One Road program that they're running. I mean, again, it's just an enormous amount of investment, and it's investment that ties in a whole alternative route right through to Europe, and there's a reason that they're doing that. And they've got the capacity and the funds to actually make that happen. So I guess the main proposition I'd sort of say just is that China will be a very dominant force of why Asia will remain strong. I think the second one, and it's a little more uncertain but still very powerful, is India. So if you look at India, very similar demographics, as everyone in this room knows, to China. But historically, it's been burdened really by democracy. If you think about it, a very difficult system for them to. So I used to think they had to have elections all the time. But anyway, there's one of those minor issues. But anyway, we managed to get through them. But realistically, much harder for them to actually deliver on the ground. So you saw it in the GFC. China said we're going to spend $1 trillion, went out overnight and literally started the bulldozers going. Much more difficult in India. But nevertheless, Modi came in with a very strong mandate, as we know from the work he'd done in Gujarat, and that's why he's still popular in India, and he's starting to do a lot more of that. Now, as I said, it's not as straightforward. There are challenges you can see there, but even the FT this morning running stories about some of the tax reforms that you're starting to see him do, but he's got a lot of capacity there, and so I think if you were just a betting person, you'd probably take an odds-on bet that India will be again net additive and for quite a lot longer period of time. And the Indian leadership know what they need to do. So interestingly enough, Manmohan Singh, when he was PM, really by the back end of that leadership period, was not travelling very well. India's growth rate slowed down dramatically. They really didn't achieve a hell of a lot. But when you had private discussions with him, he knew exactly that they needed to do trade deals. He knew exactly what they needed to do reform. The challenge wasn't that. It was the bureaucracy that fights back. And it's very much what you've seen on display in Japan. So when we started the TPP negotiations, I was really sort of at the forefront of that, because the way that all played out was that Obama liked the idea of doing TPP because he wanted to do the big Asian pivot, which, as everybody knows, was all about influence in the region. It was in part, of course, about access to this market, but it was about the United States showing leadership in the region, far more geopolitical actually than economic from the United States point of view. But they were always going to want Japan in there for obvious reasons. And I remember having a discussion with Obama about why I was concerned about Japan going into TPP, because like a few other countries, we thought there was no real history of Japan signing comprehensive free trade deals, and we thought they would find it very difficult. Not because the PM wouldn't want to do it, because Abe had already made it quite clear what the 3 arrows of reform were, but because the bureaucracy would fight back and beat him. Basically, that was the guts of the proposition. Anyway, we were always going to lose that argument because they were always coming in, obviously, along with Mexico and Canada. But in my experience of being involved in those negotiations, Abe was immensely strong behind the scenes, really arguing the case of why TPP should take place, standing up to his own officials. And he's got his fair share of challenges that he's dealing with domestically at the moment, but I would back him to continue to push those reforms. So again, the second sort of proposition is, I think, within the Asia sort of construct, you've got India as another sort of positive. Japan, I think, less clear. I mean, you've had decades now of basically stagnation, no growth, very, very weak environment, but eventually something's got to give, and it's either going to be the fact that they owe an enormous amount of money and that national debt's a real problem for them, or alternatively they are really going to kickstart the economy at some point. But on balance, I think it's probably positive. So when you look just generally across the rest of what's driving all of this, you have a number of factors in Asia that you have nowhere else, and the most common of those is young population. So you go and look at in Europe, you've got old population, you've got very old technology, you've got a lot of rigidity in their system, so a lot of rigidity in their labour markets and their pension reforms, all of these kinds of things, and very high levels of national debt. And then you look at Asia, and you've got young population, you've got modern technologies that are really leapfrogging old technologies. So, you go to a lot of emerging nations now, even the likes of, Myanmar, where broadband technology is pretty good now because they can roll these things out in a much better way, in a much more cost-efficient way than's happened around the rest of the world. So I think if you look at what's going to happen in Asia, that those fundamental points are going to come together to provide a pretty strong growth engine. So then you look at it and you say, what does it all mean? In some respects, well, for a country like New Zealand, we're just completely repositioning ourselves to be part of Asia. So it doesn't mean that we don't want to trade with the rest of the world and all of those kinds of things. But realistically, we see that as a big market for us. And the potential there is huge. So if you think about what people do when they get wealthy, the number one thing they do is buy safe food and protein. And just to give you a sense of what these numbers might look like, it's really easy to sit there like we just started a few moments ago and talk about how huge China is or potentially how massive India is. But take somewhere like Indonesia. So we spend very little time talking about them. 250 million people in Indonesia, very young, bulk of the population's under 40. Right? They eat 2.1 kilos of beef per person per year. Right? Okay, that's the average consumption of beef in Indonesia. My son eats that on Saturday night. Okay, so the average New Zealand consumption is 50 kilos. Yeah, so you just sit there for a second and you go, man, if these people really decide to turn on the tap, you know, they just get wealthier, that consumption pattern is unbelievable. And that's what you see across the board in everything, whether it's going to be lamb meat or whether it's going to be wine or, you know, whether it's going to be baby formula. I did a thing actually, interesting enough, there's a few older Kiwis in the room who remember this, but in the old days in New Zealand, as part of our aid package, we used to send milk biscuits. Remember those arrowroot milk, but we send around the Pacific, you know, and people didn't eat enough milk, you know, we'd give them these milk biscuits to eat. So I went to this thing for health reasons the other day. They've developed these things called milk bites, the little things they give them to the kids for morning tea and afternoon tea. And in China, they just can't keep up with the demand for these things. Just miles of these kinds of products. And also, what you've seen, interestingly enough, in New Zealand, just to give you an idea, is that the level of communication in China, you would think would be really poor in rural parts of the country. So you'd think across Asia, they're not necessarily well informed because they're not getting news in the same way that we are. Well, social media has changed all of that. And so what's happening is they're very well informed consumers, and what that's actually meant is instead of them trying to build, you know, more and more production locally, although they do a fair bit of that, the Chinese companies have decided they've got to actually invest in places like New Zealand and Australia. So you've seen massive investment coming into New Zealand. So Ely and Yashili setting up big operations in New Zealand, Bright bought Sinlay in New Zealand, Shanghai Mailing just bought Silver Fern Farms, all of these guys just investing because they want that made in New Zealand tag sitting on top of the products that they're buying. And that's you know sort of massive sort of opportunity. I suppose you know, if you look at some of the good things that have also been happening, you know, when you go to these APEC summits, or when I used to go every year, you know, sometimes they can be sort of rather dry affairs, and you wonder, you know, kind of what's really big. But if you look at the behind the border costs and the reduction in tariffs, there's really been a very substantial reduction over a long period of time. So really, Asia's becoming better connected, it's becoming easier to do business with each other, and it's becoming more efficient. The big challenge, I think, is where it all goes on free trade. So obviously we all signed up to the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA. As I said earlier, for New Zealand, the holy grail in a lot of ways was TPP, not because it's the best in the world. WTO reform would be, but that's going absolutely nowhere. But what we did see there for New Zealand was the opportunity to have an FTA with some pretty big economies, not the least of them being obviously the United States and Japan. The question will be what will happen with RCEP. So there's two options there. One is that the Chinese see the opportunity for the sort of lack of leadership in trade that's coming from Donald Trump and say, let's actually strategically push RCEP, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's the logical place that they go. The challenge for them is they've got to make sure that India and Korea come on a deal that's more comprehensive than what is being proposed. So getting RCEP going is not the issue. I think they can do that actually. I wouldn't have said that 12 months ago. I would have said TPP would be completed and well and truly bedded down, but it's a brave new world we live in now and it's different. But I think with RCEP the issue is, can they get a deal that's worth what they're actually doing? But that's certainly, you know, the pattern of what you're going to see. So then I suppose you sit there and say, well, what are the threats to all of this? And the obvious one is what you're seeing on display at the moment out of the United States, and that's the anti-globalisation sort of sentiment. So you saw it in Brexit, you've seen it in with Donald Trump being elected, and you're seeing a little bit of it even if you think about something like what's happening in Singapore. I mean, I haven't had this discussion with your PM for a wee while, but you know, there are plenty of times he used to say to me that the growth level in Singapore was becoming more and more constrained because people were very very concerned about the population increase. So there's a level at which they say we just don't feel comfortable that the infrastructure can cope, the standard of living can cope. And so if you look at New Zealand, we've had very strong growth in the 8 years I was PM, and pretty much one of the sort of standout growth countries, but it's really been driven off a number of factors. Obviously better access to Asia and particularly China, and more demand for our products, and a lot of reforms that have driven the economy, but equally it's been population increase and very low interest rates, and therefore a big sort of housing sort of boom that comes off the back of that population increase. So what you've got happening now, I think, is you've got that threat, I think, that somehow that anti-globalisation feeling really gets up. And it's always about an inch below the surface. So if you look in Australia very recently, Malcolm Turnbull, who you would argue, and I'm great friends with Malcolm, is very much a sort of globalist sort of, and very much a supporter of sort of free trade and free enterprise, just cancelled what's called in Australia is called the 457 visa. So essentially stopping migrants coming into Australia in a more defined way. All because you're starting to see a pushback from the Pauline Hanson type person, which sits in the same group as Le Pen and others. So that's the first thing, is you just can't be certain what the impact is on the perception of politicians, that they're out of favour by talking about globalisation and wanting to be involved in it. That's one thing. Second thing is, you can't rule out that you get involved in some sort of currency war, trade war. I mean, personally, I think it's pretty unlikely the United States would do that. But if you really look at what Donald Trump was saying on the campaign trail, and to be fair, he's actually done a fair few of the things he said he campaigned on, whether you like them or whether you don't. Personally, I don't agree with them, but that's his choice, but including pulling out of TPP, obviously, and now pulling out of the Paris Accord. He had been talking about various tariffs on China. Well, The Economist wrote a story that said if he really did what he said he was going to do, it would be the single biggest reduction in purchasing power for middle-income consumers in America of anything they've seen in the history of modern times. Because, of course, the two-way argument about trade, and we know this from a small country like New Zealand that lives and breathes off trade, is that, one, it creates jobs because you have access to billions of middle-income consumers you don't have in your own country. But the second part of that is you get access to goods and services at far more competitive rates than you would otherwise get. Nevertheless, you have to say that's a risk. The second thing you'd have to say is just financial instability. I personally think the Chinese will handle it. But even they would admit there are some issues there. The question is how deep they are and how much you get to see of them. But there's certainly some risk. Third risk, I think, is just that you get some return to rampant inflation. I think it's very unlikely. You don't see the hallmarks for that. There's still quite a lot of capacity in the labour markets. You're seeing a lot of new technologies are effectively creating capacity in the labour markets. And there's no pressure at all on an upward basis on energy prices. It's very hard to see oil prices going up substantially. I mean, I can't see why that's going to happen, because you've got renewables coming on stream at a very fast sort of rate, and you've got lots of alternatives to those. And I think it's easy to underestimate what the impact of that is going to be. But just to give you an idea around efficiency, there's a normal graph an economist will show you which correlates the use of energy demand against the growth in your economy, and they pretty much mirror each other. So if you're a country like New Zealand and you increase dairying, which we did in the time I was Prime Minister, your energy demand goes up because they're very energy intensive. Interesting enough, in the time I was Prime Minister, the economy grew at about 3%, maybe a bit more on average, and actually the energy demand flatlined. Why? Because we're just so much more efficient. We're already 85% renewable in New Zealand. We'll be 90% by 2025. And you think about New Zealand, it's got to be the greatest country in the world to have an electric car. Because we have baseload is now either hydro, which is in abundance, especially going anywhere near the South Island. It's forever raining on the West Coast and those other places, and Wellington quite a bit. But also, secondly, geothermal now, wind and solar. So you think about, I think you can look to a period not that far in the future. At the moment, what's slowing down electric cars really is that their price is about double what you'd expect to pay for an equivalent vehicle, and the distance those cars can travel is a bit limited. but it's a fifth of the price of a diesel-powered or petrol-powered car to run them. So once you get to a point that you're paying for your Nissan the same price in electric as you are for a diesel or petrol-powered car, which is getting closer, and once they can travel 250 kilometres, virtually all of New Zealand will be electric cars. You know, there'll be enthusiast cars and others that people drive, but that's the way the world is going. So, you know, I think it's very unlucky. But just the one factor I would say is that you've seen over the last, you know, really sort of 7 or 8 years, and you can make the case that it was the right thing to do, but a big build-up in money supply. Effectively, you know, the United States has printed money, you know, Japan has printed money, Europe's printed money. And the question is, what happens to all of that that's sitting out there? And the answer is, well, in an orderly way, it might kind of roll off. But if you look at what the US Treasury, or the US Federal Reserve, paid the US Treasury because of the positive carry from basically quantitative easing, the number was huge a few years ago. I haven't looked in the last year or so, but it was in the trillions of dollars. So they just have a massive positive carry trade because they're investing in anything you like, basically, but at a rate above what their issuance is. And you've seen that in Japan. I mean, gone are the days where these people are buying JGBs. I mean, they're out there buying everything from mezzanine finance to sort of debt, or they're buying equities. I mean, they've got a very, very speculative sort of book in there, actually, but they've got a positive carry. If you really saw inflation come up, you know, in a more substantial way, then that position turns negative on the back of countries which are highly indebted. So the United States, no chance of them getting back to surplus. I mean, there's just no pathway back to surplus anytime soon, in my opinion. I mean, Japan, very hard to see them getting back to surplus anytime real soon. So you've got a lot of countries that have very high levels of national debt and very high levels of sort of service. So I think that's the third risk. And obviously the last risk in the region is conflict. I have it as the last risk because I actually think it is the last risk. I think it's not the first risk. You've just had the Shangri-La dialogue here over the weekend, obviously. A lot of people spend a lot of time worrying about that risk, and I think there's every reason to worry about what happens in your back door. But you've got two fundamental risks. One's around the South China Seas and the other's around North Korea. So if you take the South China Seas, I think the real issue there is how likely is it that the situation's allowed to escalate to a point where there really is a full-on sort of conflict? And the answer is pretty unlikely. I mean, you're likely to see a lot of discussion and a lot of posturing and a lot of words spoken, and it can in a way gnaw away at the quality of a relationship, which might be a little better sometimes than you might think. But and it can certainly cause challenges for everybody involved. But the argument that was put up, I never really bought, which was the argument that when the Chinese were reclaiming all of these islands like the Spratlys and the likes, that gave them this military capability. I didn't buy that argument, and I still don't, because I think they're very orphaned assets, those assets. I mean, in 10 seconds, the United States would have more capability than you could ever imagine to take those out. The fact that they have the incredible capacity to reclaim land and build all sorts of things on it in a heartbeat. You know, we were sort of slightly in awe of that in New Zealand because it used to take forever to build a motorway. So half the time I wish they'd sort of refocused their attention to sort of the transmission gully. But on the basis that they didn't do that, it wasn't all that they'd done it. But let's be blunt, it's a very orphaned asset. It's literally an island sitting in the middle of nowhere. It's all a territorial dispute, partly about fishing rights amongst anything else, really, to be frank. So where the real risk is not that it really gets ugly. I mean, there'll be a lot of talking, but it's where you can get, you know, a couple of ships from opposing sort of sides who all of a sudden panic and something bad happens. You can get that situation. Could it get worse? Of course. I just don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And the main reason for that is I think China knows it needs to grow, and it's got to grow, and it's got to keep growing strongly, because to go back to the starting point, they've got to create whatever it is, 20 million jobs a year. They are there because basically middle China, who are increasingly educated and knowledgeable, want to get a job. That's what they want to do, and they want to increase their lot in the world. They have much better access to information than people think, and they're very sophisticated. And if the Chinese leadership can't deliver those jobs, then you threaten the dynasty. And I don't think they're going to do that. I think their number one thing is grow. And so there isn't a history of China being overly aggressive, and there is a history of them being quite mercantile and wanting to develop their economy. So that's the first thing. And funny enough, the more difficult one I think is North Korea. So the problem I think in North Korea is that you've got a very unknown quantity in Kim Jong-un. So again, I remember having a discussion with Xi Jinping about it. So he'd never met him. They knew very little about him, and he'd never been to Pyongyang. So when people say they know each other well, what they're really saying is the one country that has influence on North Korea is China. That's true. Interesting enough, if you have a look at a graph that overlays trade with China and North Korea at the moment, what you'll see is imports into China from North Korea in the last 3 or 4 months have been collapsing. So Chinese have basically turned off the tap, buying coal and the likes from North Korea. So what I suspect is really happening is North Korea is putting the squeeze, China's putting the squeeze on North Korea, trying to make them sort of see a bit of sense along the way. But the risk there is that eventually the Trump administration, which to be blunt is a bit more likely to take action. I mean, you had Obama who said, Syria, use of chemical weapons was a red line, didn't do anything when it happened. You've already seen Trump being more aggressive on that front. So at some point, if they really pushed out the boat on their nuclear capability, the Trump administration, I think, will start saying that that is unacceptable to the region, and actually will have lots of friends encouraging that perspective because it's a serious issue on the Korean Peninsula. So I think realistically, I think they will eventually control it. My own personal view is if you ascribe a strategy to Kim Jong-un, and I think it's a bit dangerous doing that because you really don't know. No one really knows. He could just be a young guy that sort of found himself in this position, who really knows. But if there really is a strategy, let's just give them credit for saying they're a bit more thought through than that, then the strategy's got to be the Iran strategy, which is they build a nuclear capability, they prove to the world that it's a lot more sophisticated than it was. We already know that because some of the testing that they've been doing recently has been far more successful. And then they go along to the Americans and others and say, you have to do a deal with us. You have to do a peace treaty with us, and you have to take some of the sanctions off. And that's their strategy, I think. But the unknown factor is who's pulling the strings there. On the surface, it's easy to say it's Kim Jong-un, but it's not at all clear. I think it's a much more of a bit of a committee in there that's driving all of that. I'm not quite sure how sophisticated it really is. It could just be that he's young and he's kind of following his emotions. But to give him, if we want to give him credit, then you'd say that's the strategy. But if you want my view, the probability of either being a major problem, South China Sea or North Korea, is reasonably low because the Chinese, again, they can't afford a problem in North Korea and on the Korean Peninsula, and they like the fact that North Korea is there. And someone said to me the other day, Xi Jinping's very invested in Korea. Like one of the first things he did when he was president was he went off to one of the commemorations around Korea. On the Chinese media that you see a lot less of here, but you see in China, Korea is starting to become more and more prominent in the stories that they show. So I think that it's in their interest actually for North Korea to be there, just to be there and be well behaved. So he's got a vested interest in that, and he won't in the end. He'll do a fair bit. The question is, how much does Xi Jinping do? I think enough to try and keep the peace, but not enough to do anything else. And there's this question of how the US respond to that. So they are the sort of risks that I sort of see. As I said, net on net, I think my own personal view will be if you go forward about another decade or two, Asia's going to continue to be a lot stronger. And I think the weakness that you're seeing in Europe is a real problem. I think if you just reflect over the weekend on what's happened in the UK, I'm quite worried about that. I think that this sort of homegrown, very basic form of terrorism is quite destabilising. It's relatively easy to do. It's very difficult for the intelligence agencies to button down, and it really saps people's confidence. And you sort of think about what's happening in the UK, they're going to have what's looking to me like a very messy Brexit. It's all very well saying that they're going to negotiate free trade agreements with the rest of the world. Well, yep, but I can tell you on average, when New Zealand negotiates an FTA with a country, start at 7 years and go out from there. They generally take a decade. They're never overnight. And you've just got a weak Europe that they're going to be, not that engaged with. So, you couple that with the US, it just depends on what happens over there. But I just find it really hard to believe that a decade from now, that Asia won't be a lot stronger, and actually Chinese leadership will be more pronounced. And I think you'll see them being a real sort of statesman. And I just finish with one last thing, and that's just to give you a bit of a sense of all this. When Xi Jinping came to New Zealand at the end of the APEC meeting, we had dinner together, and it was him and me and our wives. And I was just asking him about how the agreement to get the Paris Accord going had worked out. So he said to me, oh, well, I got Obama to come over for dinner, and we had dinner. He was meant to stay a couple of hours, and at the end of it, I said to him, look, we should stay until we get this agreed. And they stayed and stayed and stayed quite late into the night, and eventually got a deal agreed. And I said, oh, that must be great. And I said, it's good that you guys can do that. I mean, if China and the United States can get things resolved, then, the world's going to be a better and more efficient place. And he said, yeah. And I leaned across the table and I said to President Obama, I know I'm going to keep my side of the deal. The only question is whether you're going to keep yours. And when we went to the G20 a few months later, Obama made a really big point at his intervention to say, I don't need congressional support to do this. I've got the numbers to do it. I don't need those numbers. I'm going to honour it. And you can see what the Chinese will be sitting there thinking now. So here's Trump. We're now out of Paris with these guys. And I think increasingly, whether people like it or not, the Chinese are looking quite statesmanlike on some of this stuff. They're starting to talk free trade, they're starting to talk climate change. There's just a vacuum there, and if there's a vacuum, they'll fill it. So overall, pretty optimistic. Anyway, thank you very much.